The world of televangelism has just said goodbye to one of its most legendary and controversial figures. Jimmy Swaggart, the passionate preacher who once mesmerized millions around the world, has passed away at 90. But what occurred during his private funeral left attendees speechless, from hidden guests to shocking final words. What took place during his last tribute is something you won't believe. Stick around, because the truth behind Swaggart's legacy is even more unsettling than most realize. Jimmy Swaggart's death isn't just the loss of a renowned televangelist, it marks the close of a chapter that transformed, shook, and scandalized American Christianity. For more than 60 years, Swaggart's message blared from TV sets, gospel concerts, revival tents, and passionate sermons that promised salvation while often drawing controversy. And now, as family, friends, and longtime followers gather to bid their last farewell, the events of his private funeral are igniting new discussions across the country. In this video, we'll dive into the exclusive, never-before-shared details about Jimmy Swaggart's final days, who actually showed up to the funeral, who avoided it altogether, and the secret messages within his final send-off that have insiders talking. The looming question: did he truly find peace before the end?
Whether you viewed him as a prophetic voice or a fallen preacher, Swaggart's final chapter is packed with twists, heartache, and raw truths, and only now, after his death, are some stepping forward with the stories they've never dared to tell before. You won't believe who delivered the eulogy, and you'll be stunned by what went completely unsaid. This isn't just a look back, it's a tribute that lifts the veil on one of America's most complex spiritual legacies. In the last weeks of his life, Jimmy Swaggart was no longer the booming voice that once resonated in millions of homes. He had become a frail 90-year-old man, largely confined to his Baton Rouge estate, a secluded world far from the powerful pulpit he once commanded. Yet even in those final quiet days, the mood surrounding Swaggart was far from serene. Sources close to the family shared that his health had been in sharp decline in the months leading up to his death, while public reports claim he died of natural causes. Those who were with him behind closed doors spoke of a man tormented by regrets, exhausted by age, and increasingly distanced from the ministry he built from the ground up. One staffer from the Sun Life Broadcasting Network, who asked to remain anonymous, shared that in those final months, Swaggart barely said a word during production meetings. He might have been there physically, but his spirit, according to them, felt long gone. What's remarkable is that Swaggart never made a formal retirement announcement. Right up to the end, his voice continued to echo across Sun Life TV reruns of past sermons, vintage gospel music, and performances that once filled massive churches with weeping and hallelujahs. But his live appearances had ceased. His final sermon, delivered nearly 6 months before his passing, was described by many as shaky and emotionally scattered in what would be his final musical performance. Solemn piano hymn recorded in private. Swaggart reportedly chose Jesus, just the mention of your name. The lyrics, sorrowful and intensely personal, echoed through the nearly empty sanctuary where he had once preached to crowds of thousands. Those closest to him insist this wasn't just another song. It was a final plea from a man confronting his soul. Frances Swaggart, his wife of more than 70 years, remained with him until his very last breath. Their marriage had weathered public humiliation, betrayal, and scandal. Yet in his final moments, she never left his side. Nurses often recalled seeing her seated beside his hospital bed, holding his hand, whispering prayers over his weakening body. But here's what most don't know. During his final hours, Swaggart reportedly made a very specific request not to have a media-led eulogy. One insider quoted him as saying, "Let the Lord speak for me. Let the people remember me as I was, flawed but faithful." That quote, now circulating among church members and family, has reignited conversation. Was this Swaggart's last display of humility or an intentional effort to control how the world remembers him? Then, on a quiet July morning in 2025, Jimmy Swaggart died peacefully in his home, surrounded by immediate family. Hours later, the official announcement was made through Sun Life Broadcasting. Pastor, evangelist, musician, husband, and father Jimmy Lee Swaggart has gone home to be with the Lord. But while the public statement appeared respectful and polished, behind the scenes, the funeral preparations were already causing tension. On a muggy Louisiana afternoon, the gates of the family worship center, Swaggart's spiritual empire shut silently behind a modest procession of black vehicles. No media alerts were sent. No breaking news, no televised tribute. The funeral, for one of America's most controversial preachers, was intentionally kept behind closed doors. Only a small circle of people were invited. Some received elegant black and gold embossed cards. Others were personally contacted through trusted ministry connections. The message was unmistakable. This was not meant to be a public event. It was a tightly managed goodbye. But the secrecy ignited instant outrage online. Many longtime followers, some of whom had supported Swaggart Ministries financially for decades, shared their pain and confusion at being excluded. I got saved watching Brother Swaggart in 1982. I tithed faithfully. I wanted to pay my final respects, one woman wrote on Facebook, but I wasn't even told when or where it was happening. Inside the sanctuary, the control continued. The stage, once the pulpit for thunderous sermons that shook the building, had been quietly transformed into a memorial. A large portrait of a young Jimmy Swaggart stood beside a gold-trimmed wooden casket. Draped with white lily, roses, and a single open Bible dot, it was turned to Psalm 51. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. Many believe this passage was Swaggart's own personal plea after his very public falls from grace. Contrary to what many expected, the eulogy wasn't delivered by a high-profile religious figure, not by other televangelists, not by famous gospel singers, but by his grandson, Gabriel Swaggart, now a pastor himself. Standing before the somber crowd, with a voice that trembled, Gabriel said, "He was my grandfather. He was a preacher. He was a man who failed, but he never stopped pointing us to Jesus. That's the legacy I'll remember." But perhaps the most noticeable part was who wasn't in attendance. Missing were many well-known religious leaders. The very names that once stood beside Swaggart during the golden age of televangelism. No T.D. Jakes, no Joel Osteen, no Franklin Graham. Even those who had previously championed Swaggart's music ministry remained publicly silent. Why? One insider hinted that the silence was intentional. There's still a lot of unspoken tension around Jimmy Swaggart, a former colleague shared. To publicly honor him risks reigniting old wounds, and most ministries aren't willing to take that chance. The funeral featured a selection of Swaggart's most memorable gospel performances, played on screen while his old piano sat untouched on the stage. The room was overcome with sobs when a recording of "I've Never Been This Homesick Before" played, one of his most emotional pieces. But the scandals? They weren't mentioned, not even once. No apology. No reflection on the pain caused. No talk of failure or redemption. Just a continuous flow of praise for his preaching, his music, and his passion. To some, this silence was seen as respectful. To others, it felt like a denial. "They danced around the truth," said one former Bible college student who attended. Yes, he changed lives. But he also broke a lot of trust, and nobody acknowledged that. Photography and filming were heavily restricted. Attendees were urged not to share anything on social media. Even members of the Swaggart family refused interviews. It was as if the ministry was intent on preserving Jimmy Swaggart's image one final time. But in doing so, they left many wondering, was this really a tribute to a redeemed soul or a carefully staged rewrite of history? While the public farewell was tightly controlled, what unfolded in Jimmy Swaggart's final hours behind closed doors has become the center of new speculation and hushed conversations. In a quiet room not far from his longtime bedroom at the Baton Rouge estate, Jimmy Swaggart spent his final moments surrounded by only his closest circle: Frances, his wife of more than 70 years, their son Donnie, and a small group of trusted ministry staff. The outside world still had no idea. The media hadn't been notified. There were no bright lights, no camera crews, no choir, only a fragile man in a hospital bed, a Bible resting on his lap, and the undeniable presence of finality hanging in the air. One of the aides in the room that night, a man who served in the ministry for over 30 years, has now spoken out under strict anonymity. What he shared has reportedly sent ripples through the Swaggart inner circle. According to the source, in the final hours before passing, Jimmy Swaggart became unusually still. He held tightly to Frances' hand. His breathing grew faint, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then he turned to the aide and asked that everyone leave the room except him. What took place in that room, they say, was a man broken and burden finally releasing the weight he had carried for over 3 decades. The aide claims Swaggart whispered a short confession. He didn't name anyone, nor did he share specific details, but what he allegedly said sent chills down the man's spine. "I was warned the first time. I knew what I was risking. I kept going anyway." He paused and then added, "It was never about power, not in the beginning. I lost sight of the cross." And then, in a moment that moved the aide to tears, Swaggart reportedly murmured, "Tell them I tried to come back. I tried. I just didn't know how." If these final words are true, they paint a heartbreaking image of a man, trapped not only by the weight of public disgrace, but also by the crushing burden of guilt. They offer a rare and haunting glimpse into the soul of someone who had once towered as a spiritual force, but who may have died deeply torn within. But what came next makes the story even more mysterious. Just a few days following Swaggart's passing, that same aide was quietly dismissed from his role at Sun Life Ministries. No formal reason was ever provided, but inside sources say the leadership feared leaks and wanted to tightly guard the public perception of the ministry. To this day, the ministry has neither confirmed nor denied the aide's story. When pressed, a spokesperson only stated, "Brother Swaggart went to be with the Lord in peace. Any final words were between him and God." But their silence has only stirred more speculation. Among his supporters, opinions are divided. Some say the confession shows Swaggart was truly repentant. Others feel it came too late and understated a mission from a man whose legacy remains clouded by spiritual contradictions. Perhaps the most tragic part of it all is this: the very message Swaggart spent his life preaching: redemption, grace, forgiveness, was something he seemed unable to fully accept for himself. Because what happens when the preacher no longer believes his own sermon? What do you do when the man who helped millions find healing is unable to find that healing for himself? Now that Jimmy Swaggart is gone, a question once whispered in the background has become impossible to ignore. What becomes of the empire he built? And more importantly, who truly holds the reins now? For decades, Jimmy Swaggart Ministries was centered on one man. His name, his music, his voice, and yes, even his scandals were inseparably tied to the ministry's brand. His piano-led worship, fiery sermons, and televised broadcasts weren't just ministry, they were the identity of Sun Life Broadcasting Network and Family Worship Center. But now, in the absence of Jimmy Swaggart, a quiet leadership vacuum has formed. The presumed heir was obvious: Donnie Swaggart, Jimmy's only son, who had long served as co-pastor and a familiar face on Sun Life. Donnie had inherited much of his faith, father's energy, and even mirrored elements of his preaching style. But according to those inside the ministry, there's one quality he lacks, something Jimmy once possessed: an overwhelming supply, unwavering loyalty from the congregation, and the kind of reverence rooted in fear. According to several reports, some staff members believe Donnie is too rooted in the old-school approach, resistant to evolving with today's religious landscape. Others argue that Donnie's emotionally charged preaching and frequent on-air outbursts have turned him into a divisive figure, even among members of their own congregation. And then there's Gabriel Swaggart, Donnie's son and Jimmy's grandson, young, polished, and eager to push the ministry forward. Known as Gabe among the younger crowd, he leads the Crossfire Youth Ministry and hosts multiple modern Christian broadcasts. He's active across social media platforms, resonates with younger conservative evangelicals, and has become the face of a more digitally savvy, brand-conscious version of Swaggart Ministries. But beneath the surface, tensions are escalating. "There's a generational battle brewing," said one former staff member. Donnie wants to keep Jimmy's legacy untouched. Gabriel wants to evolve, rebrand, and speak to a new audience. This struggle isn't just about who leads, it's about the ministry's very identity and what its future will look like. Financially, the ministry is now standing at a crossroads. Reports suggest that donations declined sharply during Jimmy's final years, and with his death, many of the elderly, longtime supporters who viewed Jimmy as irreplaceable have begun quietly backing away. Meanwhile, maintaining a global broadcasting network is far from cheap. Sun Life manages TV, radio, and digital content across multiple nations. And as viewership slips, more people are asking, can Donnie and Gabriel really sustain it? Will past scandals finally bring the empire crashing down? Or will it reemerge revitalized under a new generation of leadership? One media analyst noted that the ministry's YouTube and streaming metrics have stalled, especially among viewers under 40. While Gabriel's outreach has shown modest growth, the Swaggart name still carries the heavy weight of its controversial past. Now, in a move-stirring controversy, whispers are spreading that the ministry may be considering dropping Swaggart from its official branding. The symbolic move would mark both a new beginning and a quiet farewell to a legacy riddled with conflict. But not everyone is on board. Frances Swaggart, Jimmy's widow and the long-revered matriarch of the ministry, is reportedly against any form of rebranding, according to those close to her. Frances insists that the Swaggart name is divinely anointed and should remain front and center in the ministry until the day of Christ's return. This internal divide is beginning to surface among the ministry's audience as well. Some longtime followers have written in, urging Sun Life to protect Jimmy's legacy. Others, however, are calling for full transparency, public reckoning with past missteps, and a clear move toward modern-day accountability. What happens next may determine whether Jimmy Swaggart Ministries quietly fades into the pages of history or transforms itself into something no one ever expected. Because in the end, the question isn't only about who takes the helm. The real question is whether a ministry built around one flawed man can continue without him. As the lights begin to dim inside Family Worship Center, and as the sound of gospel music fades into memory. As the name Jimmy Swaggart shifts from the present into the past, the world is now left facing a question it's long been too afraid to truly ask. Who was he, really? To some, he was a prophet of fire, a preacher who sparked revival, leading millions to salvation through the simplicity of the cross. The raw intensity of his voice, his music, his presence, his message. These were the things that stirred faith in cold, broken hearts. But to others, he was a hypocrite dressed in scripture, a man who railed against sin from the pulpit, while struggling privately with it behind the scenes. A man who didn't fall just once, but twice, and then avoided full accountability, choosing instead to rebuild his platform and shape the narrative of his own downfall. For many of us who grew up watching Jimmy Swaggart on television, separating those two realities is far from easy. We remember the man weeping and singing at the piano, fingers trembling. We remember the fiery altar calls, the warnings of eternity. But we also remember the scandals, the silence, the defiance. And now is passing. The tragedy of Jimmy Swaggart may not lie in the sin itself, but in the missed opportunity for true redemption, or raw public repentance that could have helped an entire generation believe again. He spoke constantly about grace, yet in the eyes of many, he never fully lived it, not with humility, not with transparency, not with genuine vulnerability. Still, there are those who hold fast to the belief that God used Jimmy Swaggart despite it all. If it were for Jimmy, I wouldn't be saved today, one viewer wrote online. I know he made mistakes, but so have I, and his message still reached me. God used a broken man. That gives me hope. And that, perhaps, is the bittersweet reality of legacy. It's really simple. Often it's messy. Sometimes it's divine and deeply flawed at the same time. And maybe that is what Jimmy Swaggart truly leaves behind, not as a saint or a villain, but as a sobering reminder that even the loudest voices in the church are still just human. His funeral was quiet, carefully managed. His final days clouded with tension and whispers of confession. His ministry now stands at a pivotal moment, torn between generational shifts and a crisis of theological identity. But the question has now shifted. It's no longer just who was Jimmy Swaggart, but what do we learn from the life he lived? Do we idolize less and discern more? Do we hold leaders accountable yet still offer grace? Do we finally talk openly and honestly about the harm that spiritual leaders can cause when their private failings go unchecked? Or do we, like so many before us, bury the uncomfortable truth along with the man and simply move on? Jimmy Swaggart is gone, but the legacy he created still lingers in every worship broadcast and every sermon replayed, in every stained glass church where someone still remembers the first time they heard his voice. And maybe, just maybe, that legacy is now ours to carry forward and to shape. If this story moved you, challenged your thinking, or opened your eyes, don't just scroll away. Like this video to support honest storytelling. Leave a comment below. Was Jimmy Swaggart a preacher you trusted? Did his ministry strengthen or challenge your faith? We want to hear your story. Subscribe for more deep dive explorations into the lives, legacies, and unseen truths of some of the world's most controversial public figures. And share this video with someone who still remembers the voice of Jimmy Swaggart, because truth deserves to be heard even after death. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay discerning, stay real.